Welcome to the course on behavioral economics. This is lecture 3 and currently we are in the first topic of introduction to behavioral economics, and in lecture 3 we are going to talk about evolution of behavioral economics. So, basically we will begin with some historical developments in fact of the mainstream economics, and then we will try to relate with resurgence of behavioral economics. So, first of all, behavioral economics finds its 20th century origin in various empirical critique of the standard neoclassical model of economic decision making. Neoclassical model will be referred to as NM in short in future. That model itself only came to dominate the discipline as economics gradually severed its traditional ties to psychological, sociological and historical inquiry. An instrumental factor in this shift has been the so called formalist revolution in economics during the immediate post World War era too. But in order to appreciate the emergence and position of behavioral economics within the wider context of the development of economic thought, one needs to bear in mind that prior to the 20th century, much of economic thought has evolved in close proximity to psychological reasoning. So, basically neoclassical economics was primarily devoid of any psychological underpinning or major psychological underpinning, but prior to that classical economists relied to a large extent on psychological behavioral aspects of economics, and over a period of time psychology lost its relevance in the field of economics. So, in order to understand how classical economists incorporated psychology in the context of economics, we would begin with the ideas and works of some of the major classical economists. Behavioral economics as we know it today may not have been around much before the 1970s, but the issues it tackles have been around for a very long time. In fact, this relatively new discipline is steeped in the past economic thinking. It is for this reason that viewing behavioral economics against the larger historical and conceptual backdrop is crucial, not only for understanding the past, but also the present. Importantly, it exposes some long standing concerns that are fundamental to both mainstream and behavioral economics. So, as I just previously mentioned that we will begin with the classical tradition. In order to do that, we will be taking a closer look at the development of the main ideas that characterize classical economics by discussing the most prominent thinkers and luminaries. This allows us to understand better the origins of the neoclassical economics that followed, and to what extent behavioral economics represents a return to some of these older ideas. So, we begin with Adam Smith. He is most often known as the father of economics or modern economics. You can also say microeconomics. His contributions to the field of economics has been immense. We would learn right now that he has probably commented on everything or most things that we study in economics today. So, without much doubt, the towering figure in classical thought is Adam Smith. As Thaler noted in 2015, in his 2015 book, the famous Chicago economist George Stigler was fond of saying that there was nothing new in economics. Adam Smith had said it all. He introduced the notion of the imaginary machine that entails the coordination of all economic activities in cause and effect relationships, the economic system. Smith was enlightened, and although he is most known for his principles of the free market, one of the main ideas of classical economics. His view was that the greatest happiness in life came not from the accumulation of money or more generally from materialism, but from the companionship of fellow men and women. So, people not only get pleasure by accumulating money, but from other sources also. So, economics must not be all about money, as we discussed in the previous lecture. It has various other dimensions which might not relate to money. Adam Smith's social views of economics were contained in his important 1759 book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which has been overshadowed by his much more famous 1776 book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, most often referred to as simply The Wealth of Nations. The theory of moral sentiment placed feelings, emotions, virtues at the center stage in economic life. Such psychological notions were rediscovered by behavioral economists, but they were there all along in Smith's classical work. They just got lost in the later development in the neoclassical's work. Smith identified the rules of prudence and justice and explained how these are required for society to survive and thrive. Smith noted that individuals have what he considers to be a natural tendency to look after themselves. This he called prudence. And he also talked about sympathy towards others. In this view, we are far from the stereotypical selfish rational creature often depicted in economics. Our actions are influenced by the emotions of other peoples. Behavioral economists talk about altruism. Behavioral economists talked about social preferences. Social elements are brought into the context of economics, much like the way Adam Smith probably envisioned it. The social view is a central idea today in behavioral economics, as I just mentioned. Smith talked about justice system primarily to deter wrongdoing and to punish those who violate social rules. Today, lawless societies are the very ones that are economically impoverished. In order to regulate individual behavior to achieve social harmony, Smith tells us that something else is required. And what is that something else? That is the impartial spectator, who is conceived as an ideal person who would completely empathize with our emotions and actions. Now, all of these require self-control, what Smith called virtue. So, we begin with the fact that the theory of moral sentiment emphasized on primarily two things, prudence and justice. So, we discussed the relevance of prudence and justice, and then comes the concept of virtue. In contrast to Smith's notion of justice, this is a form of morality that requires active deliberation. Now, none of Smith's presumptions demand much in the way of a conscious calculating human machine. So, if I am driven by virtue, then I might prevent myself from doing certain things which are harmful for either myself or for the society at large, at least in the short run. But rational decision making at times may guide us to do something which is extremely selfish, and that may not have a broader perspective of how it is going to impact the larger society. So, all of the above is in the spirit of modern day behavioral economics, as opposed to what neoclassicals try to preach or presents, and it is essentially psychological. The Smith view, Adam Smith's views are to a large extent psychological. In his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations, Smith gave us the concept of an indivisible hand. We all know that this is probably the most celebrated concept of related to or associated with Adam Smith. Whenever the name Adam Smith comes, people associate him with the concept of invisible hand, which serves to guide the efficient allocation of scarce resources in the capitalistic, that is laissez-faire economy, economies which are less regulated by governments, there are less interventions, more towards free economy. The important point to note is that although Smith talked about our own prudent self-interest, this self-interest serves to benefit the whole nation, because Smith said it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. So, ideally this is a situation where everybody is working towards their own benefit, but collectively this is benefiting for the society. I can give you some more example. For instance, in a particular country there are certain rules regarding how do we drive, or it is more like a norm. Like in India, we have left hand side driving, left hand driving, left hand walking. So, generally whenever we are on the road, we basically follow our left side, and consequently those who are coming from the front or from the opposite side, they are also following their left. So, this is beneficial for both or the community together, for everybody. Now, if one individual decides to follow the right side, so he or she will start driving along the right side, then there will be clashes, collisions, and which is not going to benefit anyone. So, as a result of which, this is a classic example when each one of us is actually working according to what best suits us. So, left hand driving suits us the most, and that is why we are doing it, and we understand that collectively this is beneficial for the society as a whole. So, this is what basically Adam Smith's idea, that even if the brewer, the butcher, the baker, they are not thinking about the benefits of the society, they are just thinking about their own welfare, but collectively all of them together is basically contributing to the social benefit or welfare. Smith was indeed one of the first thinkers to address the question of the efficiency of production. So, around the time when there was also industrial revolution, so production increased efficiency, the concept of efficiency came into existence. He noted that large efficiencies are achieved when the production process is broken down into small tasks, each one performed by a skilled operative. The power of Adam Smith's thinking is seen in the modern market economy, which by and large operates very much along the lines he articulated. So, there is an example from Smith's work, the pin factory example, which exemplifies the concept of efficiency very well. So, this is a classic example of the beneficial effects of the division of labor was seen in the trifling manufacture of the humble pin. Adam Smith visited a pin factory and observed that it required 18 separate production processes. The division of labor led to greater dexterity, that is skill, in workers, which along with avoiding the time consuming act of moving workers from one production process to the other, as well as the use of capital intensive machinery, created great economic efficiency. How great it was? While one operative could make between 1 and 20 pins a day, when labor was divided, the rate of productivity rose to 4,800 pins a day. So, basically efficiency gain was huge or substantial, or you can say enormous also, when we went for division of labor. Now, we talk about other classical thinkers, begin with David Ricardo. Like Adam Smith, before him, Ricardo argued for free trade and the virtues of non-government intervention. So, he was also a proponent of laissez-faire economy, more free economy, freer trade. Ricardo is known for his principle of comparative costs or comparative advantage. It is actually more popularly known as comparative advantage. The doctrine of comparative cost advantage or comparative advantage contends that all countries have the potential to offer something of economic value to themselves and the rest of the world. I just mentioned here that prior to David Ricardo, it was Adam Smith who also basically talked about more trade between countries, and his concept was of absolute advantage. But Ricardo brought in comparative advantage, which basically tried to tell us that even if one country does not have an absolute advantage in the production of any commodity, still on the basis of comparative advantage, countries can engage into international trade. Ricardo also advanced another important idea of the law of diminishing marginal returns. We will be talking about law of diminishing marginal returns or the concept of marginal returns, etc. later in this module and in the upcoming module while we deal with neoclassical economics more. Among other classical thinkers, there is Jeremy Bentham. He is best known for advocating utilitarianism, which advances the idea that the greatest happiness of the greatest number should be the foundation of morals and legislation. His work on the notion of utility had a major impact on the development of neoclassical economics. Whoever studies economics must be familiar with something like utility. Utility is a very commonly used concept in the field of economics, and a lot of credit goes to Jeremy Bentham for his work on utilitarianism. Bentham's philosophy can be best described as a form of consequentialism based on the idea that actions, policies, rules and so on should be judged on the basis of their consequences, that is the utility they yield. So, basically neoclassicals actually borrowed this kind of idea to a large extent from Bentham, because later on we would see that everything, when we try to convert their consequence in terms of utility, the comparison is facilitated when further the utility is converted into some monetary benefit, first thing. Second thing is that in order to compare all possible consequences, we need to bring in a lot of assumptions. So, those assumptions and all we will be talking about in the next module, but for the time being this consequentialism actually contributed immensely to the formation of later neoclassical ideas. Next we talk about Thomas Robert Malthus. Malthus is best known for his work on the relationship between population and the production of food. His most famous book, an essay on the principles of population, published in 1798, concluded that as the supply of food increases arithmetically, but the population increases at a much faster, that is geometric rate, destiny of mankind is to live on the edge of starvation. So, what he suggests is that if I have a very good life, if I have a lot of food, lot of comfort, then he says, he gives examples with animals and says that that will lead to a lot of reproductive activities, and as a result of which the humankind, like many other animal species, would tend to grow at a much faster rate as compared to the availability of food. So, the rate at which food grows, reproductive activities or growth in the population would be much higher, and as a result of which when the entire food is divided into a larger amount of populations, then the outcome would be everybody would actually live on the edge of starvation. So, from there we would start again retreating back, and as a result of which there will be population control, some would die, and then those who survive, they would learn a lesson from that, but then over a period of time people tend to forget, and again a comfortable life would lead to greater growth, etc. So, actually historically it has been observed that if I look at the last 1000 years or so, so there has been, if I plot say GDP per capita on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis, it has been observed that growth has been stagnant for large part, and it has actually suddenly picked up from certain countries, specifically those countries which we now call the developed economies, from late 18th century. For some countries it could be late 17th century, but not before that. Now, what is this long period of stagnation when the GDP per capita was not growing much? This has been explained very well by Malthus, that why it was a flat line for a long period of time. So, his interest in the sensitivity of people to incentives is something that dominates neoclassical economics, that is, people are capable of making the correct choices if sufficiently incentivized to do so. Nudging may help too. So, here comes the behavioral economics. Otherwise, incentives also play a crucial role in neoclassical economics, which might have been a major contribution of Thomas Robert Malthus. After that, we talk about Jean-Baptiste Say. Say is mostly known for Say's law, which states that supply or production creates its own demand. Build it and they will come, which happened to be the guiding spirit behind the project to build the Titanic ship, that if an expensive ship will be built, then of course there will be some takers at the end of the day. The law implies that workers receive wages for their labor, which they will then use to purchase other goods. This increase in production thus creates demand for other goods in the economy, leading to economic growth. Another example of Smith's economic machine in motion, or something like everybody working for his own benefit actually end up having or generating benefits for the society or at the aggregate as well. So, this is a principle which actually we believe till date. Everybody has to believe that if you increase the production, so basically we begin with more employment, I employ larger number of people, then that will generate some income. When income is generated, then there will be demand. When there will be demand, then we need to employ more people, further income is generated, that further causes demand, and so on. So, the economy grows through this process. So, as you can see that we begin with increased employment, which implies that we begin with larger production. Supply is creating its own demand. That is basically Say's contribution. Say also contributed to the field of entrepreneurship, but well, this is not the place where I talk about it. Then we talk about John Stuart Mill. Mill's views were expressed in his 1848 book Principles of Political Economy, which was built upon the works of Smith and Ricardo. One thing I just like to mention here is that classical economics was at that point of time was also known as political economy. Politics and economy have been always very closely connected. Mill is especially remembered for developing the idea of opportunity cost and arguing for the Ricardian principle of comparative advantage. Opportunity cost I probably already talked about briefly. It is the benefit associated with the foregone opportunity or the second best alternative. When faced with different courses of action, the opportunity cost refers to the utility or satisfaction, benefit, profit, etc. of the best foregone alternative. Finally, we talk about William Stanley Jevons. Jevons is best known for contributing significantly to the marginal view of economic behavior, which has come to exert a dominant pull on mainstream economic thinking. The marginal view, which was later formalized in Alfred Marshall's seminal work Principles of Economics, contends that the utility of each additional unit of a commodity, which we called marginal utility, decreases with further consumption. The concept of marginal or the concept marginal is actually again extremely widely used in the field of economics, neoclassical or otherwise in classical works. And marginal, we have the concept of marginal cost, marginal profit, marginal revenue. So, marginal is actually in other fields also, the concept of marginal has gained its relevance. So, we cannot actually ignore it, and it's a important contribution that has come from William Stanley Jevons. The principle of declining marginal utility says that the more we have of something, the less pleasure or utility we get from each additional unit of consumption. This is known as the declining marginal utility. We will be talking about it in later modules a little more. Now, I am not claiming that this is all about classical economists. I have just talked about few classical economics. There are other contributions as well, but then moving on to, we talk about how did psychology lost relevance in neoclassical model or neoclassical economics. So, 20th century psychology had little to offer that was tractable, that is concepts that are easy to incorporate into formal economic models and find out how they are doing. That is because, as you can see, that Freudian notions held little interest, where psychological ideas were many and varied, and it would be hard to distill them down to a set of assumptions or principles that could guide systematic, let alone rigorous economic thinking. Along with this rejection of psychology, as the 20th century dawned, academic economics increasingly followed the natural sciences in its pursuit of age-old laws and mathematical formulations. So, ideally or in simple terms, mathematics started dominating the field of economics. Talking about post-war economic approaches, in the first half of the 20th century, there were still economists who considered and discussed psychological factors in their work. For example, Irving Fisher, Wilfredo Pareto and John Maynard Keynes. The latter famously speculated both figuratively and literally on the stock market with notable success, and his contributions are there in the field of economics, behavioral economics as well. However, the general trend during this time was to ignore psychology. Psychological reasoning continued at best to maintain some currency at the fringes of the discipline. This trend continued after the World War II, aided in many ways by the advent of better computational methods. As computers became more powerful, it became possible to build and estimate mathematical models of both markets and the economic system as a whole. The subdiscipline of econometrics became a vital tool for economists as a means of both developing and testing theories. economists became obsessed with mensuration, that is the measurement of variables and the estimation of economic parameters using mathematical equations and econometric methods, and much progress was made in terms of theoretical development, and the emphasis on mathematical treatment led to greater rigor and more precise, if not accurate, results. So, that was actually giving a lot of satisfactions because of more precise results, even if they actually deviated from the reality. Some economists realized that the behavioral assumptions underlying their models were unrealistic, but there has been a methodological approach typified by Milton Friedman that economic theory had little to do with the accuracy of these behavioral assumptions or with understanding why behave as they do. So, as I probably previously mentioned, economists are more concerned about what and not why and how. As a result of which, what we are observing, decoding through mathematical models was more of an importance that it gained in the field of economics as compared to why they are behaving like this. But then, because of these assumptions or presumptions, some heretics like Herbert Simon viewed that standard approach is somewhat blinkered. He was not prepared to accept the host of ready excuses that were offered when predictions went astray, like there were temporary blips, or rather excuses that were given were like temporary blips, the introduction of new and unpredictable factors, measurement discrepancies and so on. Simon believed that it was important to understand the underlying motivation behind the behavior of economic agents in order to improve existing theories and make more accurate predictions. Simon in 1955 introduced the term bounded rationality to refer to the cognitive limitations facing decision makers in terms of acquiring and processing information. So, as this term refers to bounded rationality, the implications are pretty straightforward, that individuals' rationality or ability to optimize, to process a decision or process a lot of information to arrive at the perfect decision is actually bounded. Our rational capacities are bounded. So, we actually cannot do a lot of mental mathematics. Most of us, majority of us, 99% of us will not be able to do that. As a result of which, the concept of rationality that was dominating the field of neoclassicals is not acceptable or was not acceptable to individuals like Herbert Simon. There were several seminal papers written in the 1950s and 1960s which complemented the work of Simon, and they again and again tried to prove that decisions are not along the line what the neoclassicals have assumed. These papers all pointed to various anomalies in individual decision making if seen through the lens of neoclassical models and suggested theoretical improvements, and that is how behavioral economics was born. During the 1970s, there were important developments in the field of psychology that heralded some important foundations of behavioral economics. Most notable of this was the heuristics and biases program of Daniel Kahneman and Kahneman-Tversky. However, it was really at the end of the 1970s, or tentatively one can say, that behavioral economics was born. Two papers were largely responsible for this. The first in 1979 was Prospect Theory, Decision Making Under Risk, written by Kahneman and Tversky and published in the prestigious and technical economic journal Econometrica. The second paper, Toward a Theory of Consumer Choice, was published by economist Richard Thaler in 1980. Both Kahneman and Richard Thaler are Nobel Prize winners. Tversky died in 1996, so far I remember, or sometime in 1990s, because of which he could not get the Nobel Prize. Prospect theory not only built on their earlier work on heuristics and biases, but also introduced several new and fundamental concepts relating to reference points, loss aversion, utility measurement and subjective probability judgments. Thaler introduced the concept of mental accounting, closely related to the concepts of Kahneman and Tversky. And since 1980, the field of behavioral economics has become a burgeoning one, as both economists and psychologists have expanded and developed the work of the pioneers mentioned above. As more success has been achieved in explaining the anomalies of the neoclassical model and in developing a more complete body of theory, the field has now become a more respectable one. However, it should be made clear that behavioral economists do not conform to a uniform school of thought. Although they all are concerned with the psychological foundations of economic behavior, they may have quite conflicting beliefs regarding fundamental aspects. For example, we will see that the views of Kahneman-Tversky and Vernon Smith all differ substantially regarding the role and nature of assumptions, appropriate methods of investigation, the value of various kinds of empirical evidence, and conclusions regarding such issues as rationality, efficiency, and optimization. Besides, I would also like to add that not a single theory is able to explain all the behaviors. For example, prospect theory fails to explain some of the observations which probably mental accounting does, and then again mental accounting, the hypothesis that are laid down, it is not that they are able to explain all possible scenarios or behavioral aspects. There are things which can be explained by mental accounting principles, there are things which might not be explained by mental accounting principles. So, we might need some other principles to explain certain other kind of behavior that we get to observe. So, with this I conclude this module, and in the next module we will begin with some more introduction of the neoclassical economics. Thank you.